Welcome back to Hell Fortress Cathedral Midnight, the Enochian Terror Transmissions. My name is Val, and I bet you didn't expect to see me so soon again, did you? Well, today I'm talking to Sean Hauntonaut Oscar of the Wyrd Signal podcast, one of my favorite podcasts of all time. We're going to talk about his folk horror project, the Reeves Report. We're going to talk a lot about British politics, esotericism, the art of writing mystery in horror, the frustrating phenomenon that is Nick Land, and even have time to touch upon biblical history and what it's like to be a practicing Catholic in the modern day while reckoning with the horrors and abuses of the church. So a lot of interesting stuff on today. Enjoy.
You'll also see that my background is stuck as Halloween jack-o'-lanterns in the spooky graveyard, which it has been stuck at since November. I put it as that for mine and Matt Cahoon, Xenogothic's first planning meeting for Bodies Without Organs, and it still defaults to this no matter what I do. And I really do need to turn it off because eventually I'll have like a work thing or something on here, and it will be very, very embarrassing. But yeah, I think I might keep it up. I think I might keep it on.
It fits the aesthetic.
This for the time
You'll
being.
be known as the office goth. You know, how else could you keep your office goth cred that way? It's really streamlined.
Because I was made redundant for a while last year, and like the company had been at before, I'd worked there since like 2014, so everybody already knew me as the goth weirdo, and I've got a job for a couple of months doing a similar thing for a different company, and obviously not going to name the companies, but and obviously these are people who I'd never met, I'd never had any kind of contact with them, but like even just through like Skype interactions and like Teams messages and stuff, they all knew me as like the office goth within just a couple of weeks. And like my Secret Santa present from them was just like some spooky ghost stickers. So well, there we go. I was only there for 2 months, but I made a mark, and I'm happy with that. I'll go with that.
Fantastic. I think my coworkers are too polite to. I think they noticed, but I think they're too polite to say anything to me about about anything really. It's a very nice work environment, I'll be honest.
Yeah, it's one of those weird situations sometimes when, on the one hand, you have all of your Twitter mediated like radical left politics like going through your head in how you sort of like place yourself in the world and how you place yourself in your views on the economy. But then, you know, when it comes to actual practical stuff, it's like this place I work for probably shouldn't exist, but everyone's really lovely and it's actually really inclusive.
Oh yeah.
But these are the structures that we take with us into the new socialist tomorrow.
I do try and bring stuff up to like my bosses and stuff, and try and get them on the Sinn Féin train and stuff like that, you know. And they're like, "Oh, where would the money come from the for the free healthcare?" I'm like, "From the robots, from all the robots."
I think as a result of living in Brighton and living in the famous Brighton kind of like progressive bubble, you know, we have the only Green MP in the entire United Kingdom, a very lovely lady called Caroline Lucas. God, I hope she hasn't done something cancelable, actually, like that I've missed now saying that. Like, I just met her a couple of times at student stuff and she seemed lovely. We have Labour and like a cluster of Labour MPs all around the city, and it is just this little fleck of green and red in the middle of this great big sea of Sussex Tory blue. But I think as a result of that, like everybody who I work with is, even if they're not, you know, actively or overtly political, everybody has, you know, the correct values that I tend to encounter in the workplace.
There's been news circulating in the last week or so that a new green-red party is going to emerge in Ireland, and then yesterday it came out that it was just a bunch of more conservatives.
Well, that's not what you want, is it?
No.
And at the like to my frank embarrassment, I am actually still a member of the Labour Party. You know, I joined when I was 18, when I moved to Norwich for university. And you know, I just signed up for, oh yeah, sure, you know, these are people who I'll vote for anyway, and like, but that card has kind of like stayed in my wallet ever since. And like, I go to branch meetings very, very occasionally, and I've met my MP, I mean Lord Russell Moyle, a few times and stuff like that. But I'm certainly not an active like party member, and I'm not and I haven't like kept my membership out of a matter of devoted principle or anything. It is just like it's mildly more convenient to get rid of it than to keep on having it. And you know, I can still vote in, you know, internal party elections for the candidate that Momentum instructs me to vote for, and so on. And it is fairly arbitrary, because everything that Keir Starmer's done since he became party leader, you know, any one thing should have been enough to, you know, finally give me the nudge to cutting up my card and posting it to him.
But he's like a mannequin. He's like a mannequin of a person. Like all the dumb shit that he does, like no one remembers it. Everyone just remembers Corbyn. You're still glowing from Corbyn's media presence. So Keir Starmer's like evil mannequin just like washes over you.
He does look tremendously inhuman. There is this plasticity to him, which I find uncomfortable. But yeah, although like I said, anything he's done should have been enough to get me to leave. The stuff over Liverpool, I think, is actually going to be the straw that breaks the camel's back, because it is just so nakedly craven and such a betrayal of, I mean, like, again, everything he's done has been a craven betrayal, but just something about this one, just like, I don't know. It's also possible that I'll sleep on it and decide that, well, you know, I can still vote for the Momentum slate in the next thing, so maybe it is kind of worth staying in, especially considering that I'm not especially active. But I don't know. Maybe people can tweet me to say what I should do. You know, I'm easily persuaded.
The most interesting thing about that whole Liverpool thing is that the North is like asserting itself as a separate entity from the greater English, which is like, you know, anybody who's been in and around England at all understands that difference is there, that like people from the North are totally different from people from the South, and it's different politically, it's different, like the streets are different, the vibe is completely different. So it's interesting that it's kind of like rousing itself as this separate like political entity.
Yeah, and more power to them, really. You know, when it comes to stuff like, I don't know, like Scottish independence and so on, like part of me sort of thinks this isn't like, I don't necessarily have a horse in this race, but I'm not especially keen on the SNP because, for, you know, reasons that are fairly obvious. But at the same time, I do sort of, you know, ultimately think I like settle on the side of Scottish independence just because, well, I don't know, fuck the United Kingdom.
Yeah, just to piss off the Brits.
Just to piss off the Brits. Although, like, part of me is also aware of the fact that sort of like it would just be like, because we are so poisoned down here in the south, you know, it is just going to like even more galvanize reaction, the forces of reaction, than even Brexit did if something like that were to happen. And you know, similar with Northumbrian independence, you know, I want to see that happen for the same reasons, and you know, and because I think it's the relationship between England and Scotland is not and has never been an equal one, even though, you know, there's all the vagaries of royal politics around how union actually happened. But it's the same with Southern England and Northern England, maybe even more so. But it's always been a nakedly, well, since industrialization at least, it's been a nakedly extractive relationship between South and North. So the North has, you know, very good reasons for leaving. There is a cultural, even something of a linguistic distinctiveness in the North. So there is, and I'd say in the South, as a Southerner, you know, I've lived almost my whole life in Brighton, and I wonder how common this is actually. You know, I certainly don't like have like some kind of like distinct sense of my own identity as a Southerner, and I think that is one of, down to, you know, the Sussex, Brighton, proximity to the metropole, right? That we don't think of ourselves as having a culture because we are culture, if that makes sense. We are the standard. We speak the correct form of English from which all others are derivations and deviations, and it's. I don't know. So I don't know. In my fantasies, when I imagine what the Federal Socialist Republic of Great Britain will look like in 50 years' time, sort of like it will be a multinational confederation of the various peoples that live on this island: the Scots, the Scottish, and the Northumbrians, the Cornish, and the English, and the Welsh. It's going to it'll be very. My utopia will be a very federalized socialism.
The unfortunate thing about that kind of thing is, as you said, like as an imperial power fractures, it begins to lose like its global threat, right? But the threat of its own like maliciousness goes inward on the people living there. So it is this weird thing. Like as an Irish person, I am like, oh fuck. There's a drone factory in Belfast right now, and like a non-EU England could easily like Palestine us, but a non-EU England with a separate Scotland and a separate Wales and a North trying to split off would be too distracted to do that. So it's like Venezuela during the Trump administration was more or less. Trump was distracted being terrible. Trump's idea of a coup in Venezuela was sending in a team of tough guys on a boat who were immediately arrested. But under Biden, the threat is a lot worse because that kind of like internal collapse has been somewhat mitigated. Somewhat.
Yes, there was I'm just going to steal a point from this week's episode of Trash Future because being a disgusting lefty millennial, all of my views and information about the world come from podcasts, and I forget his name now, but the guy who wrote the Jakarta Method was on there, and he speculated that the pink tide in South America coincides with with the United States imperial ambitions shifting very, very rapidly to the Middle East. So they're no longer policing South America and Latin America, and so suddenly now they don't have the CIA as powerfully breathing down their necks. Suddenly you get socialism or experimental attempts at social formations which aren't as overtly monstrous and imperialistic. And but yeah, when it comes to Britain, when it comes to us, there is this growing sense that something is going to have to snap, possibly sooner rather than later, because there is this because everybody talks about the growing generational divide, but the actual fact of that is very true, and it isn't going to get any smaller. It is going to. Because the so-called generational divide, at least, it is a split in values, in culture, in political and economic priorities, and political and economic realities as well. There is, I'm very pessimistic about the future, to be honest with you. I do generally tend to think that I don't think things are going to improve much in my lifetime. I think it is going to be a matter of trying to navigate your way through the collapse, really.
Mm-hmm.
But what I can anticipate happening is to try and protect the currently existing social and economic order. The powers that be, the established powers, are just going to become more and more totalizing and militant, though those aren't the signs of a regime which is actually tremendously secure, and certainly not one that can rely on just the good faith and trust of the people in order to keep itself established. So I don't know, I do sometimes have these when you think about, for example, the collapse of just for example Romania, for instance, where the not to say that life under Boris Johnson is comparable to life under the Ceausescu's, obviously, but just the rapidness and how violent the shift that occurred there was. And that's something and that's not totally unheard of in other parts of the world either. It's that you can have these regimes which are very, very apparently very, very well established with a lot of power and history behind them, which just a small number of individual events and groups and sometimes people can just come together in just such a special enough alchemical combination that suddenly it just all completely falls apart very, very quickly. That can happen, that does happen. So there is but such stuff like that is something that's almost impossible to plan for. It can just happen so rapidly that you can't plan, but you can try and prepare, if that makes any sense. You can have a kind of sense of expectant readiness for when the event happens.
I think that's sort of where the cosmic terror of the algorithm comes in, where you have these, someone who's kind of looks at the world from a position of history, from a position of lived experience, from a position of empathy, and a constant drive to learn and unlearn things. Looks at the world and sees this potential for these alchemical conflagrations of mass action, right? But there are people who fucking try and sell NFTs. There are people who love Elon Musk. There are people who collect Funko Pops, and that's people's brains are being hijacked by these reward systems that are filtering through their everyday lives, and I become quite worried that such things interfere with what would otherwise be the natural course of history.
Yes, that's a very good point. And stuff like that, it's very difficult to know what possible kind of response you can have to it. I don't think we'll figure it out on this conversation either. But yeah, no, stuff like I bet it's possible that's the direction that things will go in instead, that no matter how much things change in the superficial or cultural level, which would still be significant changes because it still would improve people's lives in some ways, but it's possible that those mechanisms of control will just continue to refine themselves in such a way that I don't know. I don't think I'm saying anything especially original, really. But it's possible that the mechanisms of control that the powers that be, the established powers, have at their disposal will just refine themselves down in such a ways that they become completely invisible to us. I've been watching it in bursts during my lunch hour. Adam Curtis's Can't Get You Out of My Head, which and I have my problems with Curtis, and I think there are grounds to be, I'm not going to say suspicious of his agenda or something like that, but I don't understand too conspiratorial. But there's good criticisms that you can have of Curtis. But one thing he's doing a very good job with this series, and what he's done with his previous series, is just kind of bringing into attention exactly those kinds of soft power mechanisms and the actual real material effect they have on people's lives, the slow dismantling of the political cause capability of acting independently of the market, the gradual, or in some cases very rapid, increase in the power of the market of capital to affect changes in society and in the economy and in the world at large, independently of state interests. It's and I think what he does, if anything, the thing that he reveals, which is the most important thing that he reveals, is because people have commented about how complicated the narrative threads he's weaving actually are, and how difficult it is to see how it hangs together. But that is, of course, the point, surely, because the relationship that we increasingly have with the world is one where you can't find those guiding threads anymore very easily, where it is just this rapidly moving and self-transforming and self-effacing complex of institutions and organizations and bodies in this constant motion, so that you can't ever really be certain who it is that you're opposing. Almost, it's
which leads to like generalized ambience of paranoia.
Yes,
which you see on Twitter. Like I'm always talking about this shit with people, but thinking about like 2015, 2016 Facebook and meme culture on that, where people were like making hundreds of friends and you could just like jump in and talk to people and have conversations with people, and if you didn't like someone, you'd you'd unfriend them, you block them and move on. But like it seems like now where everybody's sort of migrated to Twitter, it is a constant like Cold War. Like everyone is in a Cold War with everybody, and the baseline is just being ready to like defend yourself aggressively against everybody you come across. It just feels like the whole atmosphere of everything changed in like 2016.
Yes, I agree with you. I think that was how dire a rupture that was. I think it is still revealing itself. And because that was, I mean, the extent of imperial interconnectedness between Britain and America is such that anything that happens in a big way in America has some kind of repercussion over here. But, so we had two crises, two giant boosts for the reactionary right in this country happened at the same time in 2016 with Trump and Brexit, and the sense of ennui, of despair that those triggered like hasn't gone away. And I'm not going to say it hasn't transformed into something active, because it has, it definitely has. This is because events like the Black Lives Matter protests that we've had in this country in a very big way, and the continued activism against the police and the naked power grabs that the police are making as an institution. Those are good things. Those are examples of that sense of despair being transformed into something direct and active and aimed at making changes. But at the same time, it's the conservative ascendancy is just so established now here that a Labour government anytime soon is just totally unimaginable, even if we had someone better than Keir Starmer. And this is manifesting in increasingly concerning ways, because the post Blair political consensus, across the political spectrum, was that the point of political division between mainstream left and right parties, between Conservative and Labour, was around stuff like government, public spending and public services, and the government stuff like that, infrastructure stuff and economic stuff. But there was this kind of like understanding that culturally we are not conservative anymore. We are not socially conservative. We are a liberal country, and the Conservative Party, under Cameron and under May to a somewhat lesser extent, presents itself as being fundamentally a liberal party in both economic and in social terms. But what is increasingly happening under Boris Johnson, every single fucking Tory who runs for Tory leadership claims to be a one nation conservative. There's no such thing as one nation conservatism. It's a lie. It's a lie they peddle. And what we're seeing under Johnson is this less of a commitment to economic liberalism, interestingly, although that may be and is likely to be more of just sort of like a pragmatic reaction to the actual physical reality that we're facing coming out of the coronavirus pandemic. That isn't going to fly, and everyone knew it was bollocks anyway. But you know that they can't do something like that now, although they will try, and they will just nakedly enrich themselves in the process, no matter what. But this is going alongside of a renewal of that kind of cultural social conservatism around the especially around trans rights and around conversations about race, and the continued refusal within British culture to have any kind of reckoning with our imperial history. It is something that is so totally absent that once your attention is drawn to that void, this is something that just goes unacknowledged. It becomes baffling. It's that this is just something that is just completely put out of our minds. Like, to the extent that it's not even something that you encounter overt attempts to celebrate. You don't encounter overt attempts to celebrate the Indian Empire or something like that. It's just this kind of amnesia over the last 300 years of British history, where we were a conquering imperial power who established the largest empire in world history. This is just, like, you get references to the soldiers from the Commonwealth on like Remembrance Sunday and stuff like that. But yeah, it's just quiet. There's just an intense quiet about it. And actually, to go back to Adam Curtis, again for his flaws, like what he's doing with I can't get it out of my head, is like the most direct attempt at reckoning with that part of British history like I've seen in. I think possibly I've ever seen, actually, sort of at least since I've been alive, because it just goes completely unacknowledged that this was something that we did, and was had played a profound role in shaping a lot of the world, as well as a profound role in shaping us. Yeah, God, I don't know.
Well, I think the Nazis were a massive scapegoat for the rest of like European imperialism. Like even like England plastered over their imperialist past by saying, "Hey, we beat the Nazis." Churchill, remember when Churchill said all that stuff about how the Nazis are bad?
Exactly.
We're England.
Yeah,
we did that.
It is the because we had the. Oh Christ! What was it? It was the what was it? It was the VE Day anniversary sometime last year during lockdown, one of the lockdowns, and yeah, and that just, and one of the things that it's something that it took me a while to realize that, going into adulthood, because this is just something that's just so programmed into it is just such a deep part of the ideological indoctrination that we go through in this country, that how much the Second World War is treated as a foundation myth for modern Britain, that like World War One is the practice run for it, which is kind of like sort of like one of the medieval dress-up wars, but it's also a proper modern one, but it is kind of like, it's not in the forefront of the national consciousness in the same way, for lots of reasons, partly because...
It's like a bad dream. There's never any kind of attempt to explain why it happened or what it even was, just that it was bad. There's just landscape of pits and dying children and gas and stuff like that.
Partly because the First World War refuses a simple narrative in a way that you can spin one out of World War Two. Because because World War One happened, no one could actually you can't ever have a definitive account for how the First World War happened, because it was an incredibly complicated series of interconnecting national, diplomatic, social crises, all happening incredibly quickly, and all of these like forces that have been put into motion like in the last 100 years, just everything crashing together, and it just happening almost like volcanically. But with the Second World War, it's not to lead into a romantic view of history to say that it's more driven by individual personalities, but it is more, but at the same time it kind of is, it is more easily explicable on the surface level, in terms of it was an event that was driven by individual personalities like Hitler and Stalin.
It's got iconography, it's got sigils, it's got egregores. You can focus the reasoning on these very specific symbols and figures.
Exactly, and you can have a very uncomplicated narrative of good versus evil based around the Second World War and sell that very easily in a way you can't with the First World War, because Britain was more democratic than the German Empire was in some ways, but we didn't have universal suffrage. Well, the Germans did have universal suffrage, but it was universal suffrage in a empire where the monarchy was an active political force, which was not the case over here. You can't have that. Except of course for the Red Army when they come along, who are unambiguously the good guys. But with the Second World War, it's much easier to frame it like that, and that does form this kind of like cultural foundational bedrock for us, and it's where a lot of the military chauvinism and the fetishization of the military still comes from, with this kind of and how these. Yeah, it's fucking hell. It's just so depressing thinking about it sometimes. And in his book, The English Heretic collection, put up by Repeater, Andy Sharp's. I think that's his name. I hope that's his name. I just know him as The English Heretic. But there's a section in that book called Phantoms of Liberty, which kind of like dealing with this, with the psychocultural, psychogeographical consequences of the Second World War, and how that has just seeped into us and continues to haunt us and our idea of ourselves and our history and our future. And it's one of those things where, again, like you are sometimes able to distance yourself enough from the narrative you've grown up in, but you can just kind of like see it a little bit more objectively and like comprehend like how strange it is in all sorts of ways. You just start thinking about the reality of like this huge existential threat that this little island was actually facing, like against that, and how weird that would be to go through, but also how this was the experience that a lot of peoples in the world had because of us coming in there as the invading power who reorganizes their society for our own benefit. It's
I remember someone made a Twitter thread a while back about how the Tyranids from Warhammer 40,000 were like a cultural memory of the Nazis, the gene stealers within and then the greater hive fleets without. Like, it's permeated even that far where it's in our like sci-fi monsters.
I will uncomplicatedly agree with that assessment. The Tyranids of Nazis, but they also are clearly us.
Yes. I mean... Yeah, the difference between any kind of white imperial power and the Nazis is some costumes and some sigils.
Yes, it's it all blurs together in ways that are not comfortable. Yes, I don't know what kind of time frame you're looking at for all this, but we spent the last half hour talking about politics and the depressingness thereof. But should we talk about fun stuff like hauntology and podcasts?
Absolutely. I mean, I pride myself on just being unexpected and chaotic and giving people what they don't want. But yeah, so I'm really interested in talking about your project, the Reeves Report. If you could give a little elevator pitch for what that is, we can jump into it.
So the Reeves Report, which I do think of as my poor neglected baby, because I've only been able to do 2 episodes of it so far because real life commitments are real life commitments, and it makes writing difficult. But the Reeves Report is my attempt at trying to capture the feeling I had as a child when I read through this great big hardback kind of like illustrated picture book thing called Mysteries of the Universe, and it was all full of spontaneous human combustion and rains of frogs and all of that Fortean weirdness, right? And
I had that book. My granddad had it. Big black leather bound tome.
Oh, beautiful! Yeah, I don't think I have that anymore. I think. God, I might have it somewhere, but I have a horrible feeling I don't. Maybe that'll be something I'll try, and I'll see if I can get a copy of it online. Actually, there might be a nice little nostalgia trip. But anyway, yeah. So because I thought, like, growing up as a kid, I had this like fascination with Forteana, although I didn't know it as that word, but just like the unexplained, or stories of the unexplained, to be a bit more accurate about it. And the Reeves Report is my attempt at having fun with that with that particular aesthetic. So not so much the aesthetic of like the cryptid as such, but more just the feeling of an inexplicable natural phenomenon, sort of like of ball lightning, of the frog encased in stone, that kind of just like feeling of the universe kind of like not quite clicking together right. And so the Reeves Report is a podcast where each episode is a report that has been given to me by this character. Just like to pull away the curtain. That is, of course, all make believe and written by me. But yeah, this creative report is given to me by this character of creator called Liz Reeves, who is a 14 explorer, and presented as fact, and kind of like sort of kind of tried to root it in actual like cryptozoological accounts or Fortean accounts, or just stuff out of my own head, and just just trying to convey that sense of encountering a mystery.
It is a serious balancing act that you're trying to pull off there, and succeeding, at least in the first 2 episodes, because I think there have been a lot of podcasts that have attempted something similar. I'm thinking of like the Black Tapes. I believe there's a show called Tannis. I haven't listened to that one, but I find these shows fall apart for me when it gets into and a lot of like movies and novels and stuff fall apart for me when it gets into giving up the goods, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes they go too far, like they're afraid of not giving enough. They go too far. It becomes like a creepypasta Reddit post, and it loses that grounding and believability. So what you're essentially doing in my eyes here is doing a masochistic exercise in constantly trying to hit the most difficult thing you can hit in horror writing, which is believability, which is trying to hit that thing where it's like, oh man, this could happen, or that you don't even think about it because you're drawn into it. Like you're trying to nail that like realistic tone. That so how do you? What's your process for doing that? How do you work on that kind of thing? How do you stop yourself from going over the line?
Oh bloody hell! I don't know. I don't think of myself as having like a distinct process that I follow with it. It's more I try to find something that already has a kind of familiarity, that something that the audience is likely to have a kind of passing familiarity with. So, for example, the second episode was inspired by like the Mothman prophecies and stuff like that. So there's already kind of like something set up there that the audience is going to be familiar with, and which I can then kind of sort of like exploit a little bit, knowing that like they're going to kind of know what this is about, or at the very least I can draw from established like crypto mythology, so to speak. Like the third episode, which I'm still working on, and really do need to get back to once I get some free time, is going to be kind of like drawing from like the Richard Shaver mystery stuff, like nice. And stuff like that. And I think what I try to do is approach it with a little bit of distance, to try and make myself and make Liz not appear to be too credulous, to try to because at the same time without wanting them to come across, or myself to come across, as being cynical or skeptical, but trying to have this kind of sense of distance there, and I think really to try and avoid getting too bogged down in the details as well is a big thing, because you said there about giving up the goods, and that is the thing that so much horror falls apart on, that they show the hand, and that's not what I want. No one wants that. No one wants to know exactly what it is that's happening. And like something I often come back to when I think about this is I forget what it was called now, but like there was an episode of Scooby-Doo, right? But it was like a feature-length episode of it. I think it was Skull Island or Monster Island or something like that. Zombie
Island?
Probably, yeah. I remember I watched...
Masterpiece.
Yeah, and I remember watching it because growing up, we only had channels 1 through 4, right? So I didn't get Cartoon Network. But sometimes when we went on family holidays, we would have like cable. Or satellite, I suppose it would be, wouldn't it? But there was Cartoon Network, and I could like watch these things, and I would do so obsessively and very unhealthily, because I was always a very unhealthy and very morbid child. And I remember when I first saw that, and I realised that like there's not going to be a guy behind the mask. This is real, isn't it? And it's also, and that's kind of what I got from that, like, and get from that now is I have like such a disdain for horror or fantasy stuff where it turns out there's a reason for all of this. Like, I don't want to know too much about that. That's why I absolutely fucking hated the ending of Ghost Stories. I've not seen the stage play, but I saw the film, and I
didn't even fucking watch it because I heard about the ending. I was just like, nah, fuck you.
I was just so, because it was such a solid what's the word I'm looking, not portmanteau, anthology of really tremendously well executed ghost stories, very, very creepy, very disturbing, with a really good framing device of the skeptic, the illusionist meeting the old ghost hunter. Like, I loved so much about that, but then it literally just turning out it's a fucking dream he's having because he's in a coma. It's just, I thought, no, what the fuck is wrong with you for writing something like that? Like, there's nothing satisfying about this.
Man, I love when that element is brought into something as a possibility, like Grant Morrison's Nameless, right? Where it's like, was it a space mission? Was it a ritual gone wrong? Has he just gone insane because he's murdered a bunch of people? I love when a thing brings up the idea that it could just be a dream in a dying person's mind, because that's the kind of thing that goes through your head when you're having like a psychedelic trip or, you know, a weird experience where like, is this all just a dream? Am I just like crazy somewhere? Am I dying or something like that? And I love that. I think that element is a beautiful thing, and I think it's such a ham-fisted thing to hang your hat on.
Yeah.
It's so insulting.
It has to be an element of it, but only in the sense that it acts as this kind of like possible derealizing of the events that you're going through. And it can't then turn out to be the answer, though, because that's undermining the thing that makes that possibility interesting because what makes that possibility interesting is the possibility that you have of radical doubt of your experiences. But narratively, it can't then turn out to actually be the reason for everything that's happening, because you've undermined the cool thing about it. Like, it's because you've given an answer, you've established a certainty about the real and the unreal. Well, the point was the ambiguity. The interesting thing was the ambiguity. So to go back to the Reeves Report a bit, so that's what I kind of like I don't think any of my stories will ever like try to like delve into the mechanism of this event, of this phenomenon, because that would be, for a start, I don't think I could deliver something satisfying that way. I don't think I'm smart enough to come up with like a solution that would actually be narratively satisfying, because you can do that, you know, that's something you can pull off. But I'm just much more interested in the vagaries and the ambiguities and the sense of moving around a mystery and kind of like putting it together, but the pieces are never fully gel with one another. Like, that's what I want to try and get. That's what I'm interested in.
I've gotten into that.
Mystery as mystery, right? Yeah, mystery as mystery, rather than mystery as being the journey to a solution.
And mystery will never be. There will never be a book, a manual on how to write mystery. Generating a sense of mystery in your work is a practice. Lately, what I've been trying to do is, when I wake up from particularly strange dreams, is write them into short stories where it hangs together as a story, like start to finish, but I don't try and explain any of it. And I'm just like, this meant something because I dreamed it, but I don't need to explain it or like, but if I can generate that sense of unease without just making it like a bunch of nonsense, you know, it's a practice of building mystery, which something like Silent Hill was great on. Something like the original Halloween was great for. But it really is something that has to be invisible and formless within the text.
Exactly.
You know?
Yeah. Because I'm working on a short story myself at the moment, because like part of the reason why I've sort of like hit pause on the Reeves Report for the last couple of months is because I'm taking a creative writing class. And I just sort of thought, okay, let's do this. over 10 weeks, and then go back to writing it, because I'll probably be able to do so from kind of like a stronger place, because I've always struggled. I love to try to write fiction, but I've always struggled to pull it off. But I'm working on
difficult.
I'm working on a short story at the moment with the working title Sothis, which is trying to pull that off, actually, which is I won't say too much about it, because just in case I like spoil it for people if I ever try to get it published. That's really arrogant, actually. So I'm like, I don't want to give too much away of the story I'm writing, just in case I sell it. But basically what I'm trying to do is exactly exactly that. Like it's about this guy who discovers among his uncle's papers records pertaining to this lost BBC movie from the 70s called Sothis.
Oh, I'm loving it already.
Which is and the idea kind of came to me from sort of a weird combination of I'm reading The Magical Revival by Kenneth Grant at the moment, and I love the serious current stuff, his thesis that the Star Sirius, the worship of the Star Sirius, is the oldest human religion. That's the original religion that our pre-human and most immediate pre-human ancestors had, and passed down onto the first recognized by human beings, the worship of the Star Sirius. And the notion of a current, of a force, a gnosis grounded in that is just a really fascinating idea. Which isn't true, but that doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that Kenneth Grant was just kind of I'll look at him making it up as it goes along, because he's drawing from material that had an established history to it, right? But its truth doesn't matter for the purposes of a vibe and an aesthetic, and especially for the purposes of writing, and especially considering how willingly he blurs the line between facts and fiction and fantasy in his magical works, with how he draws on Lovecraft and so on, which is something I know becomes much more of a big deal in the later works of the Typhonian trilogies. So that's kind of what I'm trying to do with that, and there will never be a moment I decided very early on, there will never be a moment where he finds the lost tape and he watches the whole thing, and then what this film that the BBC had to delete after it was broadcast actually was. He will find pages of the script, and he'll
Excellent.
speak to the surviving members of the cast and crew, but none of them will be able to fully remember exactly what it was that was going on, and he'll figure out that his uncle was involved in some kind of occult group that practiced some kind of sexual magic, but I don't want any of it to ever fully come together, because that's precisely that feeling is precisely what I'm trying to get. And God knows if I'll manage it.
Once again, it's a pretty masochistic project but you gotta be ambitious. You gotta stretch yourself, and most importantly, the most important thing about these big ambitious projects is you gotta get them finished. You gotta get them to the point where you're not embarrassed to put it out, and you gotta put it out.
Yeah, exactly.
You can't just sit on it. You can't just sit on it.
Yeah, but because the process that led to me starting the Reeves Report, it was very, very quick from me deciding I wanted to do it and me writing and recording the first episode. And the idea for it actually came from listening to the Black Tapes, because I had quite a few bouts of insomnia last year, and that kind of coincided with me, because during lockdown part 1, I decided to buy a DSLR. A digital camera, because I just kind of been toying with the idea of trying to get into photography for quite a while, and I decided, fuck it, go for it. And I did, and it's been an absolute saving grace getting into photography this last year, because it just because it's just given me something I can always just do if I need to do something. So I'm going to go out with my camera for a bit, and yeah. But so what I ended up doing quite a few times last year would be sort of 3 o'clock in the morning, I'd be wide awake, and I would just go out with my camera and I'd listen to the Black Tapes, and I really enjoyed the Black Tapes. I think if we were to talk about it, we would have the same problems with it, in terms
of the devil. It's the voice of Satan.
Yeah,
that's what turned me off of it.
Sure. I don't know. I mean, I kind of I've reached a point with it where I was enjoying the vibe and the journey of it enough that it's like, you know what, I'm going to carry on with it. And I enjoyed it. The ending is a little bit of a letdown, but apparently they're going to do some more of it. So and I will listen to it when it comes out. I did that was actually sort of like a bit of a saving grace for me last year when things were especially bad, because like a lot of things went wrong in my life, and in my family's life last year at the same time. So like having like something that was definitely in the ballpark of stuff that I like and was easily digestible and was something I could listen to while doing other things. There are a lot of reasons why I really like the Black Tapes, but I did also have this thought where I went, I bet I could do it better though, like myself. I bet I could sort of pull off something like this, and so that kind of like led to me like very, very quickly putting together the idea for the Reeves Report of having a similar kind of thing, only without well, I don't know if there's ever going to be an overarching narrative to it because there's only a couple of episodes. I'm certainly not kind of like not planning any kind of like big global conspiracy stuff to fold into it.
That's always where these things fall apart. X-Files, Supernatural, all of that. Once they start a big through line, they fail.
Yeah, but the stuff I really liked about the Black Tapes was when that kind of stuff was just on the level of intimations and suggestion, because that's when that stuff is often at its most interesting. And again, that's what I'm trying to pull off with the Reeves Report, and what I want to try and pull off with my fiction. And an interesting kind of like comparison is Tanis, which is the sister podcast to the Black Tapes, which I don't like. Well, I was actually very disappointed by it because it sounds like because it sounded really up my street. It's about a podcast about like conspiracy theories and mysteries, and one of the secondary characters from the Black Tapes, like going off and doing this investigation into this place called Tanis, which moves to different parts of the world, and you can find like whispers and traces and echoes of it in all of these different events and writings. All across the world, and trying to like thread all of those different things together to try to like figure out what Tanis actually is. However, they are kind of like going too far in the opposite direction, where it's just on the layer of suggestion and mystery without going quite enough into it to actually give you the meat, because it is a balancing act. Like you said, like you do need to show a little bit of those every now and again, like, and you can't just have this endless mist to it, because then there's no direction for you to go in, and it's very difficult to get a narrative out of that. And as well as that, they just like, it became obvious that they were just drawing from every single weird thing they could find and like just throwing it in there in the,
like American Horror Story kitchen sink approach.
Yeah, which often doesn't work, and they just like reach the point. Like I think I got in. I think it's about 2 seasons into it, 1.5 seasons into it before I kind of like decided, I'm just not enjoying this. I just sort of realised sort of like that. It was a little bit too J.J. Abrams, you know. So they were just kind of like throwing all of these mysterious things in there, and presumably with some kind of like faint idea of where it was going, but just without really feeling like they were pulling it off. And just like some of the writing just wasn't as good as like the Black Tapes isn't a fantastic work of literature, but like the writing was solid, and like the characterization was as good as it needed to be for you to sort of like know who these people are, and you get their motivations and stuff like that. And oh god, it was just all a little bit Joss Whedon with Tanis though. There's a hacker, like there's a cool hacker chick, and it's like no. Oh god, she does actually cite Joss Whedon at one point. She says sort of like how much she loves like Buffy and shit. So I'm like, oh god, that's no. You can't. I'm not gonna let you have that. Yeah, I don't want to just like shit talk like other podcasts, especially because I say I did actually really like the Black Tapes, and I wanted to like Tanis, but
on that note, though, you do have another podcast, which is my favorite podcast, honestly, at the moment, Weird Signal, in which
Weird Signal, yes.
Yeah, and the thing that made me fall in love with it the most was your episode on The Thing, because I have heard people talk about The Thing to the point of boredom. But when you and your co-host Lucy talked about the thing, you drilled down so deep into it, into the like subconscious, like the neuroses of like the concept of the thing and how it manifests and stuff like that, taking what I perceive to be like I'm a bit of a baby brain when it comes to this stuff, the nerdiest, dorkiest shit, which is fucking like analytical philosophy or whatever, and applying it to stuff that I love, which is horror movies and stuff, and just making the coolest, most fascinating to hear kind of conversations around that. And I just want to know about like this intersection between horror fiction and esotericism and academia. Like it's such a fascinating crossroads, because it can create like cool people like you and Lucy who create interesting conversations around it, but it also can create the demon Nick Land, and it also can create really annoying people who use that as like a hermit crab shell to avoid interacting with the world and just spew the most irritating gibberish takes into the void. Like, what is this strange universe of academia, and how it coincides with like dark fiction? And it's also a very English thing as well. It's also a very UK sort of thing, I have found.
Yeah, I mean, you're asking a lot of different things there, so I might have to.
I know it's very big. I'm sorry.
So I'll have to take my time to sort of like thread it together a little bit. But I'll talk a little bit about the history of the podcast, actually, just to get my head into gear. So yeah, I think that because like Wyrd Signal is the thing I'm proudest of everything that I've done, and that's been running for it is 4 years now, actually, because we started 2017. It was we recorded on the. What was it? 2018. Oh God, I can't remember now. But we started record. As Lucy and I were very good friends already. We met because we both went to UEA, and Lucy was finishing her final year of study. I think she was finishing a master's degree, and I was starting my my freshers year, my first year of my undergrad degree in philosophy. And we met through the UEA, the University of East Anglia Deviants Society, which was the kind of like the heavy metal / like industrial music / all just like generally alternative kind of like society, and was like my social hub for the entirety of my time at UEA. And like so we met like very like soon after I started there. We sort of like became very, very good friends extremely quickly, and really that's been us ever since. We and like Lucy and I already had like very, very similar interests. We sort of absolutely love like gothic music and experimental music and horror movies, and had like fascination with occultism and esotericism. And Lucy had like more of a grounding in history and literature than I did, while my grounding and academic background is in philosophy. So we kind of always had this vibe going, that worked very well when we hung out. And how it ended up like kicking off with the podcast actually was my friend Adam from the Diane podcast, the podcast about Twin Peaks, Diane, got in touch with me to ask, because I know him in real life through mutual friends. He got in touch with me and said sort of, hey Sean, I'm thinking of starting a podcast about like folk horror and hauntology. Would you be interested? Do you know anyone who might be interested? So I said, yeah, well, my friend Lucy, I think she'd love to be involved with that as well. So I got the three of us together, and we recorded an episode, a lost pilot. Although I think we did put it out actually eventually. But yeah, there's a pilot episode about the blood on Satan's claw. But Adam, after we recorded that, Adam sort of like decided that he had enough like podcast priorities and stuff like that going on. He didn't want to take on another project, so he kind of like bestowed it upon us. So Lucy and I kind of like sort of like nervously decided to sort of like, well, let's just have a podcast now then, just the two of us, and let's see what happens. So we got together again a couple of months later to record an episode on the Stone Tape, Nigel Neal, BBC teleplay, the Stone Tape, and yes, that's kind of like how that started and how the podcast started, and it's just went from there. And we just kind of like discovered that there was a little niche here that people really liked, and of this kind of like intersection between talking about often quite pulpy movies like stuff like the Stone Tapes or Hardware, like films like that, and also bringing a certain kind of philosophical, critical, political, historical, occasionally psychoanalytic kind of like discussion along with that. And I think a lot of the reason why Wyrd Signal kind of like took off in the way it did is also the fact that like Lucy and I were, you know, IRL friends and have been for years, so we knew how to talk to each other and how to like play off each other already, but like miraculously without like descending into like hideous in-jokes that would alienate everybody. I'd like God knows how we managed that, but yeah, so that's just kind of like, that's how that happened, and it just became something that like became a really important part of our friendship. So it's something like, this is the thing that we do, this is a really like vital living part of how we express our friendship with each other, was that we got together like once a month. I'd go up to London or she would come down to Brighton, and we would have like a weekend and we would record an episode of Wyrd Signal and we'd get drunk like before, after and during, and it was just, yeah, and it's just a really, really fun thing. And it became like, for lots of reasons, like we decided to go on hiatus last year because like we did get a couple of episodes recorded remotely. We did fucking hell, what did we do? We did Donnie Darko at the beginning of the year when we were still able to meet up. Then we did 2 remote episodes. We did Marat Sard. No, was it 2? Yeah, it was 2. We did Marat Sard and Martyrs with Nick Spheres, the YouTuber Nick Spheres, and but we kind of, and especially because Lucy is doing a master's degree at the moment, so we kind of like decided, okay, this is difficult to do at the moment remotely, and because we both had a lot of stuff going on at the time, and it was just very stressful to try to do a podcast during the pandemic, so we kind of decided let's just put on pause for like the foreseeable. But we are going to bring it back. We are trying to decide what offer, but I think we actually might have tentatively decided what our comeback episode is going to be, which I think we will be. I'm not going to like say anything definite because obviously I need to talk to Lucy about it, but I think we're planning on like doing that probably sometime in the summer, like trying to get back into the swing of things with that. But yeah, so to go back to what you were saying there about like that particular kind of intersection of like of weird ideas, of occultism and academic philosophy, and genre fiction, horror fiction, dark fiction. Yeah, so that particular current, like in the UK, begins with the CCRU at the University of Warwick in the 90s, around like Nick Land and Mark Fisher and so on, and so that, and what's interesting about that is it was like, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that like the CCRU event, whatever that actually was, really, it probably is actually like the most important, like, or at least the most original thing that's happened in British philosophy for a very long time. And it is also something that kind of like goes kind of like undiscussed a little bit just because of how strange it was. But its resonances and its impact can be felt like quite widely, like amongst the speculative realists in particular, and the impact, the influence that they've had on contemporary sort of like philosophical discussions, to the extent that even if like people don't necessarily like, and there's lots of reasons not to be a speculative realist, I'm not a speculative realist, but like to the extent that like when I was doing my master's degree in philosophy, so like my Heidegger lecturer like did feel the need to mention them in order to refute them, you know, so it did have an influence in a way, in a very real way, and the reason for that, I think a lot of it comes down to just sort of how original and how kind of exciting it was, you know, sort of like, but this was a very, very odd thing to have happened, this combination of of occultism and speculative philosophy. And I think a lot of the reason perhaps why it could only have happened here is because of the analytic ascendancy in British philosophy, and the fact that continental philosophy always exists as this kind of quasi-acceptable other that exists in the academy, but there's always like professors who are lecturers who are specialists in that field, but they exist almost, on sufferance from the established, analytic community. And at UEA, for instance, was the philosophy department there was dominated by analytical philosophers. We had like especially Wittgensteinians and TERFs, and but we also had Heideggerians there, or at least one Heideggerian there who was very influential on me. And the University of Sussex there was actually sort of like a little bit different. Like there was more of a proper kind of like balance between the analytic and the continental traditions. But anyway, like that ascendancy of analytical philosophy, I think maybe like the reason why you had this such a weird thing happen with at Warwick with CCRU was down to the fact that sort of like if you keep the lid on the continental stuff that's coming in like for so long, it's just going to go really weird. It's going to become very sort of like faintly psychotic and will explode out in a very, very bizarre way, rather than sort of like being properly kind of like mediated by the academic structure, perhaps. Why
do you think people still let Nick Land's horrible takes into their eyeballs?
I don't know, and like I've asked friends of mine who follow him on Twitter. I have said to him, but why? Like, what value are you getting from here? People generally say stuff like, come on, it's kind of like you kind of have to just for the car wreck of it all. But I don't think.
I can't look at it. It's painful. It's Nazi stuff. It's transphobia. It's hurtful to see.
And it's gotten worse because to go a little bit into my own backstory. Sort of like when I encountered Nick Land's philosophy at the end of my philosophy degree, and like a friend of mine told me about this and I think the way he put it was sort of like, he was this like radical anti-capitalist philosopher who kind of like who believed that we needed to kind of like accelerate capitalism into its own destruction, but then he went insane and he came back together again as a kind of like a weird libertarian. I thought, that sounds like a weird enough guy that I'd want to read some of his stuff, and like and this is like a period of my life I do view as the wilderness years. These are like the dark years for me, because I got very, very like interested in his ideas in a way that was not good for me, and it did lead me to sort of like in essence for about sort of like 2 years I considered myself like an anarcho-capitalist. Like I was very much in the orbit of Nick Land and his coterie. And I took a lot of quite bad ideas, at least intellectually seriously, without, even if I didn't necessarily agree with them, I did at least kind of like buy into the, well, regardless, they are still warriors for freedom of expression, and there's a certain intrepidness to all of this thinking all the same that is worthy of respect. And it was a very, like, quite, looking back on it, that was like, I could have gone in a very, very dark place if I'd continued with that. And I did, like, I won't, I think it's still up somewhere. I actually had a blog where I did sort of like was playing around with these ideas a bit in a way that, like, looking back, and it was craven and fawning in a way that like makes me feel quite uncomfortable to think about exactly where I was at the time with that. And
I mean, I nearly fell into the alt-right hole myself as well. I think any sort of white AMAB person in a imperial country is going to be susceptible to that, because that's the culture we've been raised.
Yeah, and the thing that drew me to it was precisely the aesthetic qualities of it. Like with Nick Land, obviously, like there's the like nihilistic occult cyber stuff, which is kind of like that's a vibe. Like again, I want to see that movie, right? But the
Oh yeah, me too.
but as well as that, with like the neo-reactionary movement in general, the thing that drew me to them and made me interested in them was this sense of playing with something forbidden, that there was this kind of like, these are ideas that you're not meant to hear about, like maybe democracy actually isn't a good way of protecting liberty and stuff like that. There's something like, especially if you were 21, you've just finished a philosophy degree, so you think you know everything in the world and that you're very, very smart, and you encounter this stuff and you kind of like think, oh, well, I, the clever philosopher, I'm going to follow these avenues of thought and see where they lead me. And it does prey on a kind of narcissism that you can end up with, which I had, an intellectual narcissism and a deep arrogance about myself and about my own intelligence, and also this feeling of like, because it was kind of like a fairly smallish online community where it's kind of like not too difficult to kind of like be a name people would mention. There was something appealing about that as well. Like there's actually quite like, I think part of the reason people get drawn into these things is for some very easily explicable base reasons, like at least some of the time. But it kind of
well, it's similar to the anti-vaxxers. It's similar to like I think this is becoming the great sickness of our times, is that you get fed a truth or a half-truth, like democracy is flawed, or pharmaceutical industrial medicine isn't the best, and doctors kind of suck a little bit. And then you follow that, and you follow the wrong avenues, but by the time you've gone down the wrong avenues, you've been convinced that you're privy to the secret truth.
Exactly. And as well as that, it can encourage a certain cruelty as well, and I think part of I think that kind of appealed to me in some ways as well, because there is like Nietzsche is right, there is a pleasure in cruelty, there's because of how it's the dynamic inherent to it is one where you have a superior partner because you possess a strength or possess a knowledge.
It's literal vampirism.
Yeah,
you're literally eating someone. You're gaining energy for feeling superior over
exactly
somebody.
Yes, and that's a really powerful thing to get pulled into. And there were, as for how I got pulled out of that and how not to suggest that I'd be completely immune to those kinds of influences, because that's probably something that I probably never will be. I think that's probably something kind of like inherent to maybe me as a person. If it can happen to you once, you can be pulled down that kind of like avenue, maybe it can happen again, or maybe if it is just something like so inherent to the culture I've been brought up in, that's a possibility. But the stuff that pulled me out of it then at least was several things kind of like coming together. Partly was my friend of mine, Bobsy, who sort of introduced me to Elizabeth Sandifer's stuff and her book. I think this is before it came out actually, but her stuff, Neo Reaction, a Basilisk, and Jack Graham's stuff on the same blog, on the Toddler's Hereditarium. And I remember and I think it was Jack Graham who said this actually, and El Sandifer used it in her book when Graham talked about Mencius Moldbug, and there's a comment that he made I quite like, for sort of like, because like a lot of this stuff that like Moldbug said is kind of true. Like when he says that like we think we live in a democracy, but we don't, because like the levers of power like don't terminate with the voters, they terminate with the opinion makers, with the ideological producers. And what Graham uses this really nice analogy that Moldbug is kind of like a brown dwarf star. Like he didn't have like enough mass to collapse and become a main sequence star. So in the same way, like Moldbug never quite goes far enough to become a Marxist, but he does recognize that there is a gap between the ideological structure of society, how society is meant to work, and how it actually does work, and those aren't the same things, those aren't identical, and that and which he is right about, but then he doesn't push this far enough, so his view is and he goes in a completely wrong and a direction with it, a very, very nasty direction with it. So their stuff like was really good, like counterbalance to the seriousness of a lot of this like stuff around Nick Land, and especially like fucking Scott Alexander. And I honestly I could spit when I think about how much value I put into that man's opinions for a long time. That fucking guy. And just like having this kind of like very intelligent and very witty counterbalance to it, like helped deflate that sense of seriousness of it. Whereas these guys are kind of losers, though, aren't they? And I suppose that like I also like was a good boy, and I went away and read Anti-Oedipus because I thought sort of like, well, you know, like they're always talking about Deleuze and Guattari, I should read them. I read Anti-Oedipus. I thought, oh, this isn't what Deleuze and Guattari meant at all. This is something completely different. And finally, when I went and did a master's degree at the University of Sussex, and I took a module in critical theory, and that like the last tendrils were kind of like finally burnt away by that experience, and I realized sort of like how like badly misled I had allowed myself to be, because I do think there is some like there is culpability on my part, certainly. Like like I said, it was appealing to certain, you know, baser instincts and baser desires I had around sort of like a feeling of self-importance, the feeling of intelligence.
The thing about them being losers is important as well, because I think a lot of from like fucking people that I've known in my life that turned out to be Nazis and stuff is that they were incredibly incapable of like living life day to day in certain ways, and they were sort of like using these right-wing ideas as excuses. So like that realization of that all these kind of like lofty like heroes, like people who place themselves as these intellectual warriors, are a bunch of fucking dorks. Like that helps you realize that you're like, oh, I may be falling for this because there's something I'm not doing, or something I'm kind of hating myself for not doing, and I'd rather find a drug to sort of like, or an excuse to not do that than actually do it, right? And the people who see that and don't have that realization are the people who scare the shit out of me.
Yes, it's yeah. And when it comes to Nick Land himself, like I've not followed his stuff like actively for years now, and I'm very happy with that as an arrangement. But like when I do like check in on his Twitter every now and again to see like what mischief he's getting up to. Like one of the things that like, I don't know how true this is, but at least how it strikes me is that like he's gone worse, a lot worse. Like he was always a shitlord, obviously, and he was always coming out with horrible shit. But like he would still come up with like interesting takes every now and again, and like his blog was still something like felt like worth checking in on to see what stuff he was coming out with fairly regularly. And there's just this none of that there now. And even if there was, like obviously that would somehow justify the horrible Nazi shit he comes out with, obviously. But it's kind of like, well, it's again just to steal something from Trash Future, right? It's kind of like Riley's Law, you know. Like once you start tweeting turf shit, like you never post normal again. Yeah. And it is the same kind of like thing with like Nick Land, and like people have pointed out like considering his intense misanthropy, his confidence that human beings are going to get deleted and replaced by a different order of intelligence anyway. Like, why the fuck does he care about the trans threat to women's sports? Like, why is this something you give a shit about, Nick? With like when you think we're all scum who ought to be exterminated by Skynet anyway. Like, why?
It's the easiest like exposed cultural vein to vampire off of when you become a shriveled enough mummy.
Yeah, it's this like. Oh God, yeah, and again, it's one of those things. It's kind of like Scott Alexander, but like when I think on the fact I used to hang off your every word when I was much stupider than I am now, and just because like I don't know, like I'm not even like, because like the stuff that you got from like the CCRU stuff, like the stuff in Fanged Noumena, it's stuff that I would say that like people should, like, if you're interested in, like, sincerely interested in like accelerationism as a intellectual arena. I'm not gonna say movement because I'm not sure if it's strictly speaking it's a movement, but as a sphere of discussion in which there's some very, very interesting and empathetic and righteous good people involved coming up with really interesting stuff like Matt Cahoon's Gothic. Like, then you should read Frank Newman because there's stuff in there which is enlightening and does influence that. But at the same time, I don't think there's any value to be gleaned from what Nick Land says and does now at all. And again, like, even if there was, that wouldn't make it all right.
Yeah.
But I just...
What I'd like to say to anyone who still follows Nick Land is substitute him, nicotine patch doll, with Gordon White. Gordon White is an anti-vaxxer, like a crypto-fash cult leader, but he talks about interesting shit every now and again. Like,
I met him once, actually.
Oh yeah, how did that go?
Oh, very, very, very briefly, but it was at the Absolute Calamity, which was the London Occult Conference back in 2015, maybe, I think it was. It's when he was still living in the UK, and like, because me and Lucy, a previous project that we had, and this was with Chris Richford, who we had on the episode The Thing. We had this project called Pray to Limina, which was this zine we printed, which was kind of like this similar kind of thing to the Reeves Report, sort of like this kind of like quasi-factual exploration of occult stuff that we were making up, basically.
Yeah.
And and we were, so all the events like the London Occult Conference and like the Satanic Flea Market events, we would always go there to sell our stuff, sell our shirts, sell our magazines and stuff like that. And and like Gordon White was there, and I kind of like sort of like at one point just like went to find him, say just to sort of like say, oh hello, I listened to Rune Soup, and I actually can't remember anything about the encounter except it happening, but I think I remember him being ever so slightly stuck up. But
like Gordon.
But yeah, I haven't listened to Rune Soup for ages, actually.
I mean, the last episode I listened to it on, he had some woman on talking about how water has memory, and talking about that dude who did those quote-unquote experiments where he like said like Hitler to water a bunch of times and then photoed the molecules, and the molecules looked scary and shit like that. So he's gone way downhill. I used to be or SPM, like I used to be in his like classes and stuff, and I tell you, he got some good fucking magic stuff going. But after a while, he kind of ran out of content and just decided, fuck it, it's a cult now. We're gonna be a cult.
But that is very disappointing, because I started reading, because I have Starships. I got in the box.
Great book. I love his books.
Actually. Chaos
Protocols and Starships, great books.
Yeah, but like even with Starships, like I got a little bit like, I never finished it because it got a little bit angsty over sort of like how it was obvious he was sort of like either not doing like proper research into certain things, or if he was like deliberately presenting the most exotic interpretation of like historical stuff he possibly could. Like he was talking about stuff in Indonesia, and I kind of looked at, I forget what it's called, but I suppose
Man Madol.
Yeah, and I looked it up and sort of like said like there was an enormous amount of controversy about if this even is an archaeological site, and there is like Indonesian like nationalist involvement with trying to promote the idea that this is actually like the world's oldest temple. It's like, Gordon, I think they have a vested interest in wanting to present Indonesia as like the world's oldest culture. I'm just saying, I think that might be what's going on.
His go-to tactic is to hint at something incredibly outlandish and just be kind of like, but everybody knows that, don't they? And then just drop it. So you're just like, I have to look into this. And it's just something completely... Like 9/11 was done with a directed energy weapon that turned the buildings to ashes and stuff like that.
It's, oh, God, yeah. Like, because this is always the thing. Like, because I should be obvious to people who've been listening to this or people who follow my stuff, I fascinated with esotericism and occultism and conspiracy culture and UFOs. I live for everything like that. But at the same time, although I definitely do have like, I'm ever so slightly more credulous than I should be towards these things. At the same time, like, I don't know, like I want to see the evidence all the same, like I'm here for the vibe a lot of the time.
Yeah,
right? I mean, and because that's where the fun's to be had.
I think a lot of people don't realize that if you are sure of yourself it doesn't hurt you to just believe stuff every now and again. If you're not gonna fucking commit a suicide bombing or send someone like $6,000 for a doodad that will clear your chakras, it's okay to believe in Mothman, and it's okay to believe in magic, and it's okay to believe in these things. And hey, sometimes you get weird results that like you're like, oh, okay, but like most of the time, it's just kind of good for you. It's kind of part of human psychology to have kind of a mystical outlook at things. It's kind of like a release valve for stress in your brain.
Absolutely, yeah, and and it's so like, and it is a frustrating thing. Like if you are reading about this stuff, or like sort of like you like trying to like get a good grip on what's actually like the material that's actually out there, and you just have to wade through such just nonsense, just absolute like nonsense where there isn't any value to be had from it. So it's like once you find like the people who kind of seem to know what they're talking about, like Mark Pilkington, for instance, who I think he runs Strange Attractor, which is a very, very good publisher of like occulture and stuff like that,
and Grant Morrison
and Grant Morrison, yeah, where there is this like they are very like grounded, sensible, and know what they're talking about. And they're kind of like wacky enough to be fun, and
they're
like
not trying to sell you something or fuck you.
Or if they are trying to sell you something, it's only £10, and you will have fun because it's
it's like fun art or a book or whatever, you know.
Exactly, yeah. And I would actually like I would commend to listeners of this Mark Pilkington's book Mirage Men, which is an absolutely fascinating look at the UFO phenomena from a very, very grounded, sensible, journalistic perspective of looking at the role that like US military intelligence has had in deliberately propagating UFO stories for their own purposes. It's absolutely fascinating. It really is. Like, and it did like I went away from that, but kind of like essentially being a UFO believer as a result of that, because the case for and actually that's actually the thing I kind of like definitely holding out on, you know, in fact in the next. That's the thing that's going to turn out to be real of all of it. It's not Atlantis or the Yeti. So no, it's going to be UFOs. That's the thing.
I don't know. I've been converted to Bigfoot over the last couple of years.
I think I'm heading there. And again, you know, I'm willing to be convinced of more or less anything.
There's a great YouTube channel called Bob Gimlin, and he has these little documentaries where he lays out like the evidence and stuff. And he also does this great mini documentary about other cryptids that might be real. Like there's a giant octopus off the Caribbean called the Lusca they've gotten like evidence of its like body, and it's killed people. It's documented to kill people, but no one talks about it. Fascinating shit. The documentary on YouTube is called Cryptids That Kill by Bob Gimlin.
Please send me that. Are you familiar with the what they call it, the missing 48 or something like that?
The 411. Yeah, David Paulides. Yeah. He is a very controversial figure. Like some people really, really are like, oh, he doctors the evidence. He talks, you know, he makes stuff up and stuff like that. And some people are really credulous. He is one of those tricksterish figures that I'm really not sure where to sit with. But fuck, I believe that people go missing in them woods. That's for sure. I mean, I've seen shit myself out in like just on like sacred sites in Ireland and stuff, and people don't go missing there. But like. You wouldn't know it when you see some of the shit that can happen. So I believe that out in America, like this scarred, like traumatized land that, like, you know, when people wander off into the woods, it snatches them up sometimes.
Yeah, it was put really well in Max Brooks' not especially good most recent novel, Devolution.
Oh, man. I had problems with that book.
Yeah, like it wasn't great, but like
he does love Israel. He does love Israel, that boy.
Why? Yeah, he does love Israel, doesn't he? And it's, but yeah, there's a bit in that book that I did really like where they just talk about like the size of the American wilderness. You know, so they said look at like a picture of the United States at night, and just look how much of that map is dark as opposed to how much of it is lit up. And because that's like, I
guarantee you, he nicked that from a Bob Gimlin documentary.
I will happily grant you that. Please send me that channel, because that sounds like that's tonight sorted out now for me.
I will do.
But yeah, like when it comes to that, because I have like. Because like when it comes to sort of like my actual sort of spiritual practice, I'm actually quite conventional. I'm your standard kind of like gay Anglo-Catholic in practice, despite sort of like the fact that I literally have the magic. Oh, hold it up to the camera! I literally have the magical revival next to me right now because that's my downtime reading. But I have like. Despite that, like I have like a very, very sort of like witchy sensibility, and I also definitely have this kind of like very, very deep sense that whatever the divinity is, it isn't reducible down to a single religious current. You know, I don't think God is an Anglican.
I respect Catholic revivalists, but as an Irish person, I've tried to interface with it and got my ass kicked by like ancestors and like land spirits and stuff like that, because in this land, Catholicism is not welcome. I do respect people who go for the Catholic revival thing, but stuff like the Tuam babies and the laundries and all that, I mean, in this country, it's just too steeped in violation and pain to find like peace in, you know.
Yeah, I think something that I think all Anglo-Catholics, High Church Anglicans, like we always go through this. I mean, like the whole like Anglicanism itself, the Church of England itself, is like always been in a perpetual state of identity crisis as to, you know, is it an offshoot of Catholicism? Is it a Protestant church? Or is it like somewhere in between? Like the church officially describes itself as being Catholic yet Reformed, of a continuation of the ancient Catholic tradition, but through the influence of the Reformation Fathers, and resulting in a church which is a very ecclesiastically and theologically cluttered and jumbled one, where because in my hometown Brighton, I worship in St Bartholomew's Church, which is possibly, I'm going to say it's the grandest, most beautiful Anglo-Catholic church in the country, in my opinion. And literally 5 minutes around the corner, you have like the most god-awful evangelicals. But again, Anglicans, like, it's still like the Church of England. And I think, but for Anglo-Catholics, for High Church Anglicans, like the temptation to cross the Tiber, as it's put, is very real. Like, because there is, especially because of the evangelical ascendancy in the Church of England, that like the temptation to cross over to the Roman Church is a powerful one, and I have considered it very strongly at points. Though, should I just like bite the bullet of the contradiction and be a practicing gay Catholic? And eventually I think that concluded the answer to that was no, for quite a lot of reasons. But a lot of it was like, because the Church of England has its own horrendous history, and actually like the Diocese of Chichester, in which I live, especially, has a horrible history of like recent abuse and cover-up. The Bishop of Lewis, who only died a couple of years ago, was a sexually abusive man and a predator, but ultimately it was just the not being able to get away from just the actual the intense abusiveness that has happened under the auspices of the Roman Church, like, it's a very, very recent history, especially in Ireland, but also in this country and around the world. I just reached a point where I felt like, you know, I barely can hold myself together as an Anglican, considering the Church of England's place in society, its status as the established church, its reputation as being the Tory party at prayer. You know, I could just about manage this. I don't think I could cope with Roman Catholicism because of that, and none of which is a reflection on any individual Roman Catholic, and especially not a reflection because I'm just saying this because I have people who follow me on Twitter who are gay Catholics,
who have needs to be
reckoned
with.
A lot. Yeah, it's something that, like, those aren't things I've been able to square, and like none of that's a reflection on anybody else's spiritual journey. And I know a lot of, especially gay people and trans people who have found peace in the Roman Catholic Church. And this isn't about you. This isn't about Catholicism. Is bigger than papism. None of this is about that. But I couldn't do that. And as well as that, it is also. I would have to foreclose too many intellectual and spiritual possibilities for myself as well. Like, because like although I do go to church every Sunday, I do take it very the Eucharist is a very, very serious part of my spiritual life. At the same time, I do have this awareness that there's other stuff going on for me spiritually, which is in tension with my Christian tradition as well. But which I'm kind of fine with. Again, like, I'm happy to bite the bullet of contradiction about quite a lot of things in my life, because I'm confident that God will somehow sort it out in the end for me. But
have you done any exploration of the Goetia?
No.
I think you might find some. I'd recommend proceeding with caution and maybe not doing the straight up like Solomonic summoning stuff. But like, I think those entities in their histories, not even like direct interaction with them, have a lot to teach about like world history and the history of religion. And Lucifer Princeps by Peter Gray is an incredible book about how gods become demons and how that was a huge part of culture in the biblical times. Really, really fascinating book. I don't like Peter Gray at all, but that book is fucking amazing.
Yeah, it's and that's something that I mentioned on the third podcast, Bodies Without Organs, which we probably should talk about a little bit before we finish tonight.
Oh yeah,
but,
we'll give you a chance to pimp that, and then we can go to bed because it's late.
But yeah, and I just say, because I mentioned it in the most recent episode, the Robert Alter translation of a Tanakh of the Hebrew Scriptures that I've been slowly working my way through. He's a Jewish scholar of comparative world literature and comparative religion, and his translation of the Tanakh, he wanted to, like, he'd done two things with it. One was try to repeat and preserve the resonances, the poetic resonances that exist in the Hebrew, which most translations just completely flatten out of the interests of for theological reasons, often, actually, to try, especially by Christian translators who want the Old Testament to look as Christian as possible. But secondly, he wanted to really, really ground it as a piece of world literature in what we know about its historical context, which isn't the history that the text gives, which we know is a heavily mythologized self-understanding of a national mythology that the ancient Israelites had, and how they came to a sense of distinct nationhood for their own national traumas with their enslavement by the Babylonians, and how this seems to get read back into some kind of very early story they have about slave revolt, which definitely isn't grounded especially in history, but clearly was a narrative frame that was available to them as part of their history, that we revolted against God led us out of slavery once before, and he's done so again with Cyrus instead of Moses. And but one of the things that he does with his with the truly voluminous footnotes to this translation is just talk about how weird a lot of this stuff is, in a really, really refreshing way, and especially making it quite clear that especially for the many authors of Genesis and the other texts of the Torah, more so than the later texts in the Tanakh, these people are not monotheists. The Lord God Adonai El Shaddai is their deity, the deity who is claimed and with whom they have a covenant, but it is a reality to them that there are other gods who exist and are perfectly real, but we have, through our father Abraham, a covenant has been struck with us in our blood, and this God, he is the one that we worship. And how this, and the tensions that exist in the text, and how difficult this is for people who want a fundamentalist, plain monotheistic reading of the whole of Scripture, which is not possible because it is not there, and how you have all of these different competing understandings of what God is and who the deity is, and the relationship there are with other gods, all running through it, and that kind of and that is such, for me, that's such a more spiritually enlivening way of understanding the Scriptures, understanding it as being this great chaotic working out of where a people stood in their relationship with their own religion and with other religions, and how fractious this is and how contradictory this is, and how much of it is, attempts by later redactors to try and iron everything out and like place Israel's God as being the supreme God of all the universe, and in fact the origin of the universe, and how you see like traces of that like in even in Paul's letters. However, is this almost Gnosticism in St. Paul's letters, who's a much more interesting figure than his the reputation that he has would leave you to believe, because the reputation that exists of Paul is he's the nasty misogynist homophobe, as opposed to the lovely kind Jesus, which is like, if you actually sit and read the New Testament, you see that is a completely inaccurate picture of what's happening with Paul. But there is this like great weirdness in Paul's writings all the same, where he talks about sort of like the angelic powers that rule over the universe, and how they have been sort of like caught up behind Jesus in the train of his victory and stuff like that. And it's just so weird reading this.
It's also very militant. I find that quite chilling, how the cores are. It's like military history. When you get to the core of the Abrahamic faiths, it's about war. It's about military. And it's about domination and conquering. And I'm coming at it as a like black-pilled Gnostic, right? And I just find that infinitely horrifying.
I mean, this is the reality of the ancient world, though. This is that this like especially sort of like the. For the Jews, for the Israelites, their national history is how it is preserved in their holy texts is one of a people who are enslaved coming to a self-assertion, but how this is a violent one. But this is but what's even kind of more curious about it is like what we know, what we can like say confidently in historical terms about the actual origin of the Israelites is that they were part of the greater Canaanite milieu, who developed a distinct form of henotheism and then monotheism, as opposed to the polytheism of the rest of of their neighboring cultures. But this was still like the culture they're emerging out of, the stuff I'm not a historian or a biblical scholar, but the stuff in the Old Testament, which is like most consensus that is just sheer make-believe. It was just invented out of the whole cloth. It's like the books of Joshua are these like stories of like the great genocidal military conquests that the House of Israel embarks on. That's the stuff that like looks to be sort of like either like an incredibly like propagandistic distortion of real history, or possibly is just sheer invention, giving themselves this like history of themselves as conquerors, as well as their history of slaves and revolt. But this is like the military stuff, like when it comes to the origin of Christianity, is very like, because there are these, because like Paul uses all sorts of metaphors in his language. Like he does use military metaphors. He talks about like the armor of Christ, but he uses athletic metaphors as well. Like talk about like the race that we are on together and so on, and how he has to sort of go to the church in Jerusalem to make sure he's not been running in vain and stuff like that. He uses every kind of vocabulary and every kind of metaphor available to him to convey his message. It's yes, and the reality as well for the people who he was talking to at the time. Their lived reality is that they are a colonized people under the Roman occupiers, and the I don't really know where I'm going with this, but so this kind of like this like imperial language that is sometimes used around Jesus in Paul, about like Jesus as the Son of Man coming in the clouds of glory, and his victory, because like the word like is normally translated as coming, as in the second coming. The word in Greek is parousia, which literally means to arrive, but had connotations of the emperor's arrival in a city, his parousia, which is especially like what the emperor's return from winning a war, and this is his triumphant return to his city.
I think what you're trying to get at, if I'm not mistaken, is that the Bible is almost sort of a revolutionary text. It's about escaping oppression and overthrowing oppressors, right? And with a bit of fantasy of the victory coded into it, right?
Exactly, yeah. And that the victory, so like the emperor who is not Caesar is in fact the crucified Christ, rather than because there was not a single coherent messianic expectation in Roman Judea, Roman Palestine. At the time of the advent of Christianity, there were competing messianic expectations. There were different opinions about who the Messiah was going to be, if it was going to, and a lot of people expected it to be like Cyrus, the Babylonian, the Persian king rather, who destroys the Babylonians and set them free from their captivity in Babylon, while others expected to be sort of more of a spiritual revolution or a cosmic revolution of some kind. And Jesus, whoever he is in history, how he presents himself at least is as a spiritual understanding of the Messiah and the coming true reign of God that is on its way, and but all the same, even though he isn't strictly speaking preaching political revolution in the way that we would recognize it, all the same, like that this is a threat to Caesar is very obvious. And was a threat, and that this is a threat to Herod is very, very obvious for everybody involved. That saying that Caesar's kingship over the earth is not final and absolute; it belongs to somebody else, and that in fact we are already under his authority right now. It's I forget how we got onto this tangent though, I'm afraid, but
it's interesting though. Like what I've gleaned for that is that the Old Testament is this kind of like grand war fantasy, and then the New Testament is like, and when the leader shows up, he's actually going to be real chill, and when all the fighting's done, we're all going to be real chill just like him. It's almost like a plot twist in the New Testament, like this shocking like avant-garde plot twist. But anyway, we've been going for almost 2 hours now, so if you want to pimp, it's been a fair clip. Like it's been fascinating. I'm really glad I got to talk to you. Hopefully it won't be the last time.
Yes, this has been absolutely lovely. This has been a wonderful.
I'm so glad you enjoyed yourself. I was worrying that I was keeping you hostage, but yes, Pimp Your Buddies Without Organs, a very interesting and abstract and esoteric podcast that everyone should check out. Also, one more thing. After that, if you know any small projects that not many eyes are on that you'd love people to look at, let's hear about some of them too.
Yes, okay, so Bodies Without Organs, which you can find on Twitter. I think it's BWO Pod, or you can find it through my Twitter, which is at Hauntonaut. That is a podcast I do with Matt Cahoon and Corey Wright about Deleuze and Guattari, a little bit more focused on Deleuze and on Guattari, and that is us three buddies coming together to just sort of like try to figure out whatever the hell Deleuze and Guattari were talking about just together. It's something that I kicked off early towards the end of last year because I decided I wanted to learn more about Deleuze, and I thought this would be like a fun way of spinning some content out of it because I didn't have a lot else going on at the time. So that we have like a fairly irregular release schedule. We've had like quite a few episodes out now, so that's something you can go listen to if you want to learn a bit more about Deleuze. Other stuff, God, I'm trying to think. Like I know, like as soon as I like turn off the recorder, I'm going to think of a load of like really cool projects that I should give a shout out to. But what I will say though is Acid Horizons is a really good podcast. I really like. They have a spin-off podcast called Inner Experience, and they interviewed Andy from the absolutely fantastic black metal band Caina on there, and that's actually just been some really, really cool metal that I've been listening to as a result of that. So check out Caina. I guess because he's got a new album out, so like buy that on Bandcamp. It's really good. That's Caina, I think. Caina. God, what else? I'm trying to think. Like, God, I don't know. I can't think of anything. Well, I've had a really, really tremendous amount of fun here, because honestly
I was very nervous about this conversation. I was afraid I wouldn't be able to like I was afraid we'd just be kind of sitting here going like, you'd be like, well
I'll be honest, like, so I had a bit of an energy crash like right coming up to this. It's like, oh God, I'm not going to have any kind of pep at all. But podcast energy is a real thing, and
Yes, it is.
no, I've had so much fun, and I'm certain this won't be the last time we talk.
Alrighty, cool. So, yep. If you could just send me that as an MP3, that would suffice, and then I'll get it up and send it on Google Drive link and get it